My name is Greg Burns, and this is the October 2016 meeting. Today, Kevin Kline will be joining us to tell us about how you can become the most important IT person in the room. Before we get to that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our group. First, thanks to my employer GCI for providing this wonderful conference room and WebEx stream. The Seattle SQL User Group is a new past chapter serving the SQL geeks who live and work in Seattle. Because SSSUG doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, I decided to call us SQL Seattle instead. My employer, GCI, has agreed to let us use this space for the meetings, and we plan to have monthly meetups to discuss all things SQL Server. If you're interested in contributing to this group, such as volunteering to help with meetings or speaking, thank you. Please send us an email at sqlseattle@gmail.com. So here's some upcoming events. Today, of course, we have Kevin Kline speaking. This week is the PASS Summit 2016 at the Washington State Convention Center, where all SQL geeks from all over the world are gathering to rub elbows. Next month's meeting will be sometime in November. We have not set a date yet, and we don't have a confirmed speaker. The plan is that we're going to be coordinating with our sister chapter, the Pacific Northwest SQL Server User Group in Redmond. We'll be having our meeting within a few days of each other, ostensibly so we could share speakers. I'll be sending details soon via the PASS mailing list. Speaking of which, if you're a member of PASS, you can affiliate yourself with the Seattle chapter by logging in to sqlpass.org, clicking on the PASS chapter's local chapters, searching for Seattle, and then clicking the join button. Then you'll be on our mailing list. I promise not to spam you too often. All the chapter information, including links to slides and videos, will always be hosted on our new website, sqlseattle.org. More about that in a minute. Communication is an important part of running a user group, so we're in the process of setting up websites and social media for the chapter. Our past chapter site is at seattle.sqlpass.org. This is the official landing page for many people who might find us by searching through the upcoming events on the sqlpass.org website. SQLpass.org is a .NET Nuke engine, and it's not very versatile, so we registered a domain name, sqlseattle.org, and we're setting up a new WordPress site to be the hub for all chapter communications. We'll have a blog and event pages and links to other SQL resources. We've also set up a Twitter account and a Facebook page. This gives the public a way to discover and interact with us. I set up a Google group to allow members to communicate with each other without exposing their email address to the world and to spam bots. This group acts like a listserv, if you're familiar with that. You send an email to the group address, and then it's forwarded to everyone else on the list, so you can have conversations via email. I don't have your email address, so I can't send you an invite, so you should go to the link on this slide and request to join. Finally, we've set up a YouTube channel where all the video recordings will be posted. It's an ugly URL. But that's because YouTube requires you to upload a few videos and jump through a few hoops before they'll give you a vanity URL. The plan is that the channel will also be called SQL Seattle. You're noticing a trend here. So now for our feature presentation. Kevin Kline, a longtime Microsoft Data Platform MVP, lives in Nashville and is a founder and former president of SQLpass.org. He's an international speaker and the author of many popular IT books, including SQL in a Nutshell. Kevin tweets at @KEKline and blogs at sqlsentry.com/KevinKline. So now we're going to join our meeting, already in progress. Here's a production note. You may notice me clicking around at first because I was making sure the audio and video stream was working. Also, I had a hot mic, which I turned off after a minute or so. Thanks.
So let me also mention that one of the good things about having your user group in a city where there's a conference about SQL Server happening is that people may actually have some swag, which in this case I brought all the t-shirts that I can lay hands on. I've got 1 small, 2 mediums, and 5 larges. They're exactly what I'm wearing right now. And so we'll give those away.
I also have some swag.
Away the premier version of your flagship product?
So yeah, let's do that. No, I'm serious. We'll give away a copy of SQL Sentry, which is a, what is that, $2,900 value? Sorry? All right.
Oh, I'm
so
kidding.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Well, because you're a flagship, I thought it was, yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
So so what Jimmy is talking about, which hopefully you guys have heard of Plan Explorer. Who's heard of Plan Explorer? Okay, so those of you who haven't, you hurt my heart. Just kidding. So it does for you everything that you ever wished Management Studio did for you in terms of tuning queries. It does things like when it shows you the execution plan, it highlights in red or orange or yellow the degrees of badness of things that are happening in your particular query. So it makes it very easy to identify what are the really expensive steps, operations that are happening in the execution plan, how bad they are. If you hover over anything that's colored, it will tell you, for example, the light orange color will tell you that the estimated and actual number of rows retrieved is more than 10% different. And so that is a really good indication that you have bad statistics, for example. Now, that product was free, but we also had one other SKU that was $295. And that included a whole bunch of additional features. And then we had another SKU that was going to be released at PASS that was $495. And about a month ago, we decided to actually give away all of that as the Plan Explorer free product. So I'm not going to take too much time to demo it, but if you will go to century1.com and look for Plan Explorer, it's one of the first things, or if you type in century1. We just changed our name, so we're no longer SQL Century, we're now Century One. And if you do century1.com/plan-explorer, you'll go right to the page, and it's so free we don't even ask for an email address. It has a kind of the product has kind of an interesting provenance. We created the tool for our internal support team to help our customers troubleshoot their issues. And one of the things that's kind of unique about our team compared to the other companies that I have worked at, like when I was at Quest Software, if you called support, the support people had a certain amount of time to resolve your call. And if they didn't, if level 1 didn't help you within 30 minutes, they had to escalate you to level 2, and so on. At our company, our support people are not judged on, the metrics don't have anything to do with how long you're on the phone with them, or anything like that. The metric is how satisfied is the customer at the conclusion of the call. And they're allowed to stay on the phone as long as it takes to help you. So one of the things that they would do is actually help you fix your SQL problem that they thought was a problem in the tool, our flagship monitoring product, right? And so people would say, well, how did you figure out that this query was the problem? And like, well, we got this little internal tool that tells us what's happening. And people would say, you have an internal tool that helps you troubleshoot a SQL statement? We're like, yeah. They're like, well, give it to me. We're like, it's not really a product. We haven't, we don't have error messages really. But eventually that's why we decided to go ahead and make it free, right? So once people started to download it and really enjoyed it, people love it. And we have hundreds of thousands of users of Plan Explorer. So please avail yourself of that. It's so free, we don't even ask for an email address. We won't spam you, right? Okay, so my name is Kevin Kline, again, K-E Kline. I tried to use my 2 first initials so people wouldn't think I'm this actor named Kevin Kline. And it just happens that my birthday is on Friday and the actor's birthday is today. And I was referenced like in 14 different emails about, oh, I love the Ice Storm, or, K.E. Kline, Dave is my favorite movie. I'm like, wrong guy, but I appreciate you following me. Right? So.
That would be fun.
No, he doesn't. He's much better looking. Although, a side note, I was an extra in a movie called Space Camp. Do you remember that one in 1985?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they came to Huntsville to film it, and I was an extra in that. So my brother put it on YouTube. I think I'm on minute 23. You can see me in the background. You wouldn't recognize me.
You weren't the robot?
No. So what's this about? Most important IT person in the room. So when I was part of the leadership of PASS, one of the things that we experienced over and over again was that we were in charge of this large professional association. The board of directors were at the peak of their professional skills. But one of the things that we began to see over and over again, a pattern emerged that these fantastic technologists struggled enormously with what was now primarily a political and interpersonal job, right? So you're now part of the strategic top-level leadership of this, what is in effect at that time, it was about a $4 million a year organization. And people would just totally flounder. Why is that? Well, if we had a Venn diagram of all the skills in our life that make us really successful IT professionals and all the skills that make you a competent leader and political persuader, the Venn diagram overlaps about 2% right there in that middle, right? So you were lucky if you were actually really good at those things. Something happened somewhere in your life where you learned how to be persuasive. And it definitely wasn't when you took a class on C#. You got that skill somewhere else. And so as I was ending my tenure with PASS and had been president for a couple terms, one of the things I tried to do was construct some material that would become the part of the institutional knowledge of the organization to help incoming board directors be more effective than what we were seeing the traditional outcomes for people who are now leaders rather than individual contributors. So we'd have people who say, came onto the board and they're like, I started this big website and everybody loves this website. Who did all the programming? I did. Who built all the web stuff? I did. Who built all the databases? I did. Who's a good leader in this situation? I am. Are you sure that you were actually a leader? I mean, I would absolutely agree with you that you were extremely accomplished, right? You did some amazing things, but was that leadership? So let's talk a little bit more about that. But first, a commercial interruption. So our company does a lot in the community to make, that's part of our DNA. Let me make that smaller. And so we have a really good website called SQLperformance.com. And about every 9 months, we put out an ebook about what's going on SQL Performance. The ebooks are $10 in the Kindle bookstore. You can get them all for free if you go to SQLcentury.com/ebooks or century1.com. Now, they're not little disposable pamphlets, right? The smallest of them is 320 pages in length, right? And they're very kind of hard-hitting. Hi, Diana. Hello, welcome. They're pretty hard-hitting stuff. It's all about performance choices, typically, is the kind of thing we write about. So let's say, for example, you're writing a select statement and you need to handle nulls in your select item list. You could use an isNull function. You could use coalesce function. You could use a case statement, right? In which performs better. So there's an article in there that looks at all of those and kind of outlines how they perform. And the short answer is, if you want the TLDR, generally coalesce performs better, except when it doesn't. Right? So there are some situations where isNull outperforms it, but coalesce typically performs better. But it's nice to have empirical evidence, right? Because anyone here not a data person? You don't really care what the evidence says? Because I'll just tell you right now, you're in the wrong meeting, right? Right, exactly. Yeah, I wandered in. I smelled pizza. All right, so that's our commercial interruption. So a couple things to think about. This presentation has 2 sections, okay? The first is how to be the most important IT person in the room. The second section of this discussion is why data professionals in the world of IT, why we are in the sweet spot for career longevity, okay? So think of it in that context. We have 2 different kind of things we're going to talk about, and a lot of this will help, I hope for most of you, will help you not only be a valued member of the IT team, but will help you become the person on the IT team that when top management walks into the room, you're the person they look to with the highest degree of confidence and credibility, okay? There are certain things that we do as IT people that we actually shoot ourselves in the foot. And if you've been around for a while, you probably see that train a-coming. And you turn to your friend from time to time in these meetings and you say, this is going to go pretty badly, right? So maybe you'll recognize it in yourself, but hopefully you'll recognize it from what other people have done, right? This is not a mistake you've made, but maybe you've seen it happen. And so we'll cover some of that stuff. So let's talk about the global macroeconomic context. That's the first thing for us to talk about. So this is kind of wordy. There's a lot of stuff on the screen here, but there's a couple things that are happening in the global context that means that life is going to be pretty good for us for 10, 20, or more years. So one of the questions I get a lot is, hey, isn't the cloud kind of commoditizing a lot of our jobs? I have some friends who are sysadmins, and they're like, our data center is smaller than it used to be instead of bigger. They're putting stuff up in the cloud. Well, yes, actually the cloud is pretty threatening to certain job types. It is not necessarily threatening to our job type. If you're a developer, if you're a DBA, a database engineer, or a data scientist, you're actually in a great position to be in. So let's take DBAs, for example. DBAs have long been rated one of the top jobs to have. In the USA, it's rated the 12th best job overall, and it's rated as the 5th best job in IT. There has been structural undersupply of database talent for the last 20 years, running 3 to 4% lower than what is needed in the marketplace every year, okay? That's why we have decent salaries. It's hard to learn our skills, and there's not enough people out there, and that's why we have this term that if you Google accidental DBA, you will get hundreds of hits, thousands of hits, because managers walk into a room and they're like, my DBA just quit. What the heck am I gonna do? You're closest to the server, you're our new DBA. And you're like, I don't even know what databases are. It's like tough, right? There's not enough DBAs. So that's the first thing that's happening on the supply side. Not enough people are going into the business. There are plenty of CS degrees you can get, but not many universities have a data degree, right? So the public doesn't really think of it very much. The other thing that is happening is there have been a series of studies lately that have shown that about 40% of the people who are currently serving as DBAs plan to either retire, get a promotion out of database administration, or to do something that's going to get them into a higher paying job. Because the average age for a DBA today is 46 years old. Now, I'm going to be 50 at the end of the week, and I've got like 3 daughters of marrying age. I've got 2 kids in university. I've got like 100,000 things to pay for. And if I was a routine DBA, I might be thinking, I need to be looking at that next promotion, right? So that I can afford all of this. So that means not only do we have already a constrained supply, we have a declining supply of talented database administrators and database engineers. Now, just knowing the most elementary and basic things about economics, what happens when our supply is limited or goes down? What happens to prices? They go up, right? In the last 2 years, the average rate for a DBA has gone up about 17%. And they expect over the next year it'll go up, over the course of that 3 years, you would say a 31% increase in salaries for DBAs. Interesting thing there is that it is, the majority of that increase isn't in the big cities though. What's happened is if you went to Idaho, for example, from here, you would see that a DBA was paid a lot less than a DBA here in Seattle. What's happening is in the less populous cities, those prices, those salaries are becoming on parity, Seattle and Boise, right? So that's where the price gains are going up because people are going to their managers in Boise and they're like, I think I'm going to move to Seattle and make $30,000, $50,000 more. And they're like, oh, well, let me see if I can get you something, right? So we have that on the supply side, but there's 2 sides, right? There's supply and demand. And here's what's happening on the demand side. We've got CEOs who come off of airplanes and they've just read the Delta Sky Miles magazine. And they walk into your office and they say, boom, we need to do big data. Fortune magazine says we need to do big data. And you're like, we don't even do small data well. And so what they know is that if they sit down and they type in a query on Google, I can get a result set in like 3 seconds. How come I have a staff of 20 people and I can't get a result set in 30 minutes for some of my reports? And so it's front page news now for Fortune and Forbes and The Economist and these, stuff that the executives read to talk about the value of data. So what we have happening now is people who run small companies, 50, 100, 500 people, and at the high end, Bank of America and those kind of companies where they're saying, we probably ought to take this data stuff pretty seriously. We see that this president beat this president, and part of it was because they had this team of data scientists who could help them raise more money. Data might be really important, right? So we have this really interesting confluence of factors in the macro scene in which supply is steady or going down, and demand is going way up. So we are in a sweet spot, okay? We are in a good position. There will be some jobs that will be commoditized. But let's talk about that a little bit. Other people in IT. And so, again, I worked at Deloitte for many years. The data center was huge. There was 1,000 people that worked in this building. I recently went and visited some of the DBAs there and had a chat with some of them. And the electricity bill when I worked there was $64,000 a month. And it dropped about $12,000 a month because they pulled out a whole bunch of disk-based I/O, and they put in flash, right? Way faster, but also
moving the bottleneck to the CPU where it belongs.
Yes, moving the bottleneck to the CPU, but also they just use a lot less. There's a lot less heat. There's a lot less electricity used in them. The air conditioners don't have to run constantly, so they save just in electricity. They saved a lot of money. And so I'm still in contact with those people all the time. And so, yeah, there are all these people responsible for the hardware, for racking servers, for setting up VMs, but they're really not hiring anybody in those teams. It's a non-growth area because every new project, they evaluate whether they can put it in the cloud or not, right? And some of the times they can't. A lot of times they say, no, this has got important information. But, you talk to a sysadmin, he's like, I don't care if this server is being used or this VM is being used for SQL Server. I don't care if it's being used for Exchange or SharePoint. It's just a server to me. It's just hardware, or it's just a machine, right? 2 doors down from me, my best friend is he's the head of the global exchange management at Deloitte. That's all moved to the cloud. It's just emails to them. It wouldn't matter if he worked for Sears and Roebuck, right? The guys on the network team literally said to me once, and this is what gave me this insight, was he said, it's all just TCP/IP packets to me. I don't care if it's for the tax division or if it's for the audit division at this company. And by extension, I don't care if I'm working for radiologists or if I'm working for the country's biggest flower provider. It's all TCP/IP packets to me. With developers, it's a little different. Sometimes you really have to know the business. Sometimes you don't. It depends on what kind of developer you are. How much do you care about it? But here's the thing that really, really resonated with me in the context of this discussion. I had some customers who were like, they worked at the country's number 1 and number 3 dialysis companies, right? And Nashville is a hub for medical IT. I worked with some guys who had a big practice management system for radiology. And their SQL Server data, which was big blobs that stored x-rays and MRIs and things like that, if that didn't get to the right people at the right time, people could die, right? And on the other side, I had some friends who worked for the largest floral company in the country. And for all but 2 months of the year, they could literally just go to work and sleep all day. Except for the month before Mother's Day and the month before Valentine's Day. And then it was on like Donkey Kong, right? I mean, they were selling everything. But the rest of the year, it's like snoozeville, right? So extremely important for you to know about the data that your company is working with. And so one of the things I began to notice at that time was that the data professionals I were working with usually had 2 attitudes. One attitude was, I'm just the DBA. I'm just here to make sure our backups are recoverable and that it doesn't crash, and then I put out fires. And then there was another set of DBAs who were like, I need to know what this company is all about, because that will dictate what the business flow is like during the day, during the week, or the month, or the year. It will dictate whether I need this kind of high availability or that kind of high availability. It will tell me all kinds of things that will inform what my job is, right? And so I had one set of people who cared about not necessarily technology, they cared about solutions. And then I had this other group of people who cared about duties. I'm here to take backups. And I saw really different career trajectories for these kind of people. So that is contributing to where this discussion is going. The people who started to learn about their data as DBAs, okay, so keep in mind, I'm seeing some DBAs who are really excelling. They're like getting invited into the conference room with the top level managers. The architectural discussions, the C-level discussions. And so I see people who care about the business, and they know how that's impacting things. Then the other thing I began to see, and I would talk about with my friends who were following those particular patterns, is they were thinking about their data not as individual facts, right? Remember in data modeling, what do we call a table? An entity, right? It's a thing. It sounds like a science fiction horror movie or something, right? And then the columns, they're attributes, right? They're descriptions, they're descriptors of that entity. Those are also things that you might use to describe a storyline. And so I began to watch these people that I worked with, these people that I sat in past board meetings with, and some people I'd just be really bored. And I was like, wow, this is a lot of facts. And let's be honest, we're data people, so we tend to think that the best way for us to resolve any dispute or any conflict is a rational approach. Let me get all my facts in order, and I will win this argument, or I will win this debate because my facts are better than your facts. But that only works if the person or people you're talking to are rational, which is about 20% of the people, right? So that means you're going to lose 80% of the time, right? The people who won these debates and these discussions and persuaded everybody else at the table to follow their point of view, they usually had facts. But what they started with is the story. What's the story? And stories they resonate with us, right? Human beings have been sitting around fires telling stories for between 100, 200,000 years, right? I mean, a long time. The entire Ice Age, which was 14,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, 4,000 years, we had an Ice Age, right? You had to sit around a fire a lot of the time. And what are you going to do all those long nights, right? You're going to tell stories. And so I would sit at a table and someone would be proposing something new, and they would be talking about how we need to do all of this new stuff, and we need to use this new product called SharePoint, right? And people would say, okay, well, tell me about SharePoint. And they would win this argument because they would say, look how easy it is for us to do these things. I can put this document up here, I can do this, I can do that. Boom, I can comment on it. They're like, wow, that is a solution to so many of my problems. And then I'd have on the other side of the table, raising my hand for those of you online, I'd be like, well, factually speaking, SharePoint is actually an abomination of a database, and it does all these things. And they're like, but the managers are like, I don't care. It solves my problems. What a beautiful thing, right? I'm like, how did I manage to lose that argument, Well, I'm not saying that the other people were telling these kind of timeless stories like Don Quixote or, Romeo and Juliet, but there was something that really resonated. And there's a fundamental truth in this. One of those kind of fundamental truths, is that people don't want to click 15 times if they can click once, right? They don't want to do all of that. And so that other person won the day because they had a better story. They weren't thinking about it as these facts and details and stuff like that. They were saying, okay, I'm going to approach this as it's about human beings interacting with each other, and we're going to give them what they want. And that's what won that story. So the acronym I use for this in my folder is MIP, the most important person, right? But also, that's your acronym for how to win these arguments is you build a story that is memorable, impactful, and personal. So let me illustrate that. About up through the 80s, if a university wanted to raise money, there was only one way to do it. You get a bunch of freshmen together who had some scholarship requirements to, do some service work for the university, and you put them on the phones, and you'd have them call this list of alumni and beg for money. That's what their job was. So one of the Ivy Leagues eventually said, I wonder if we can do this better. And so what they did is they gave them 3 scripts. The first group of people in this study group had the traditional script. Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm a student in the School of Business Administration. I see that you graduated in 1969, and we are wondering if you would like to contribute to the university, Dr. May. And they'd say, oh, I love my university, of course. I'll write you a check for $100. The second group of people, they were given a different script. And that script said, you introduce yourself, you tell what school you're in, you talk about the person you're talking to. I see you graduated in this and such year, and this and such, and then you talk about what kind of things your contribution will do for the university. Like, hi, my name is Kevin. I see you graduated in 75. Are you still VP of engineering at this and such company? Oh, okay, that's great. Hey, we were wondering if you would contribute to this year's fundraiser. We actually have plans to use that to build a new building in the School of Engineering. And we're going to outfit these labs. And you were a student, so, we could see how you might appreciate having some new equipment in that building. All right, and then the third group said, hi, my name is Kevin. See, you graduated in 82, and I just wanted to let you know, anything that you contribute, about 50% of that is going to go to the scholarship fund for Maria. And Maria is a student who would never be able to attend this university without your scholarship assistance. And if you contribute, this will fund her for the full year. And not only the full year, it'll cover her books, all of her labs. She will literally be able to have an Ivy League education in a way that she could never possibly have. And she is one of the most qualified people in her state. She scored so high on the SATs and the ACTs. So this is really going to enable someone who deserves it to get through college. And what do you think won? Which technique do you think raised the most money? It was 3, right? Right. Yeah.
It's personal.
It's impactful. You're going to change this young woman's life, right? And it wasn't long after that we began to see commercials on television that sounded like this. Hello, I'm upper crusty white dude. Did you know that 10,000 doggies get stabbed in the head with a pencil every year? And they show all the, it's like, no, the puppies, no! It's like, and you hear some Sarah McLachlan song playing in the background, in the arms of the angel. And you're like, no, I must stop the puppies from getting harmed, right? And like commercials changed because people realized we got to tell a different kind of story than what we were telling. Because people will respond to the idea that if you do this, you will fix something that is horrible. That's like, used to be when it was like some of the poverty relief funds and starving children kind of stuff. They'd say World Relief Organization needs your help. But what do you see now? You see starving children, right? And for us as IT people, you don't have to be that good of a storyteller. You don't have to have a starving child to really make this work. If you just say, hey, here's the way our lazy butts can get through the day a little bit easier, people will be like, oh, sign me up for that. I want that, right? Here's how, the facts say that SharePoint's not great, but the result says that SharePoint is awesome because it makes our life so much easier, right? So that's, and you may still think, no, SharePoint is all, I don't know. But what the point is that if we make it about what makes us happier, because you're probably talking to your peers, you're going to win those arguments a lot more often than if you just come in with really good details and facts about why that's a bad idea or this is a good idea, okay? Now, the other thing that happens in these kind of movies, and these stories and stuff that really stick with us is neurological. So has anyone ever heard of this thing called the amygdala? Or amygdala, thank you. I totally mispronounced it. Some people call it the brainstem, right? Or lizard brain, right? That's way, way, way down close to our basic body operations, right? It's responsible for things like fight or flight responses. Yeah? When you tell a good story, that's what gets tweaked, not the cerebellum, which handles facts and details. That's up here. And the scientists say that the cerebellum up here is a pretty recent addition. It's not the first thing your brain knows to flip on, right? So, I remember back in 1975 sitting on the front row with my friend John Rutledge, and there's all this explosions and noise around us in this movie theater, and there's all this smoke, and then you hear I bet you know what I'm talking about, right? Even though this was 1975. What movie am I talking about here? Star Wars, right? This is Darth Vader walking in, and we're like, this person is totally evil. We've seen him for like 0.1 second, and we already know that, right? That's the amygdala. Thank you. That was good. Amygdala. Right? Those things are you can get really instant responses. And people can use that in negative ways, too. I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a moment. So we're sitting around the table, we're talking about things. Remember that although we think we're logical, we're really a lot more emotional than we're willing to admit. And if you talk about emotion, you can actually win a lot more situations where you're trying to persuade people. So here's an example. I think everyone here will know the acronym FUD, F-U-D. What's that stand for? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And this is something that salespeople, particularly from Oracle, I'm not naming names, salespeople will use all the time on you. And they're very subtle about it. They'll say things like, well, if you don't want to use this, that's fine. A lot of people don't really need to back up their data in the way that, that would require this kind of expense. But what are they really saying when they say that sort of thing? Well, you don't really care about your data that much, right? You don't care if it disappears suddenly, right? You're not afraid of that, are you? Right? It's okay if you don't do this. That's all right. The universe will get you, but I'm fine with it. You do what you want. That's kind of the appeal that fear, uncertainty, doubt is about, right? It's not about the logical side of things. It's about the emotion. What are you going to tell your boss when this finally crashes because you didn't buy it? It's no skin off my nose, I don't care. That's what they're doing. They're hitting those emotional responses. We can do that too in a very positive way, particularly when we know what our data is about. When you look at a database schema, like one of my best friends back in Nashville was the product manager for an OB-GYN practice management software. And I did a lot of tuning stuff for him because their code was unbelievably bad. But but one day I went in and he's like, look at this data right here. And he pointed out some records. And I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. He said, no, you don't understand. This is a family, a man and a woman who've tried to have a child on 3 separate occasions and had miscarriages. And they couldn't, so they're going to try some new therapies. Just looking at the data. And I was like wiping tears from my eyes. I'm like, I've got 7 children, they can take one. I don't care. And it's like, really, that would make me pretty happy, actually. 1 son, 6 teenage daughters, take 2. But yeah, data tells a story. Even if it's, when you look at your data, and I don't know what it's like where you work, but it's very, very probable that most of your data is dull. It's not really exciting. Maybe it's sales data or something like that. But it will tell a story. Do you know what that story is? And when I began to learn that myself, when I was at Deloitte, and even when I was at NASA, because, if you don't have drinkable water, you can't go a long time without drinkable water, So, I began to figure out that knowing what, rather than that this is an integer column, when I began to understand that these values have significance in a really, really important way, that's when I began to get really, really good feedback when I was talking to the business people who didn't care about databases, right? And this is just kind of an analogy here. A lot of people hate history, and it's probably because the person who taught history insisted on them learning dates, right? But when you hear the story of William Wallace and you see Mel Gibson, freedom, you're like, oh, that's kind of a cool story. I kind of like that. But you're like, well, what year did it happen in? You're like, I don't know. And then you get an F for it. You don't love that, right? it's the same kind of way with data. If you know your rows, your tuples, that kind of stuff, but you don't really know what the story it's telling, it's not going to appeal. It's not going to have that kind of persuasive power. So, it looks like my slides got screwed up there. So, what this is saying is, if we go back a slide, data plus story, if you add the story to the data, that can give you both the emotional and the intellectual connection. Okay? That's how you can win a lot of these things. Now, the other thing, too, that I want to point out, and this is not in the slides because I want to have people to have a reason to listen to me rather than just download the slides. So this doesn't appear in the slides. How do you get credibility every time you sit down to a table with decision makers when you're unprepared to answer? There is a trick to this, okay? It does require preparation ahead of time. So what a lot of us do is we just go to work every day, we kind of slog along, and we go home at the end of the day. And we're kind of like, it's a paycheck. Some people, though, actually try to understand what's the mindset around here. And I'm not talking about when you read the mission statement of a company. Have you ever been in line at a rental car place and you're standing there waiting for Avis to call you up to the counter and you read the mission? They have the mission statement posted everywhere. And when you finish reading, you're like, that is the biggest load of BS. We strive to, serve our customers in a timely way, and it's like, come on, right? So, step one, to have an opinion that will score you credibility points, even if you're not the winner at a discussion, is to know what your shared values, moral, ethical values of the team are, okay? So when I was at NASA, we had data that we were collecting for these things that meant that if we did our job right, people would be healthy and able to stay in orbit for a long time, and repairs would be minimal and it wouldn't cost a lot. On the other hand, years later, I went to work for a company that produced products, okay? In their case, they needed to get a certain set of features to market within a certain amount of time to make their product sellable, right? So in the first case, we had a shared team value of it is critical that our data is solid, right? This data quality comes first, right? People's lives depend on it. In the second scenario, how important is data quality there? I'm not trying to make this a negative, positive thing. That just wasn't the shared value. The shared value in that scenario was speed to market, all right? So if my boss called me in and the other heads of the different teams, the dev lead and the user experience lead and the QA lead, and said, I think we should switch from Visual Studio to AngularJS. And here's the reasons I'm thinking we should do this. And the dev team leader's like, yes, I love shiny new things, let's do it, And it came around to me how I would answer. I don't know anything about AngularJS. I don't even know if I could recognize AngularJS code if it was put in front of me, right? But what I do know in the first situation is that quality is supreme, right? So I'm like, well, do we have the same kind of tools? What's the experience of the team? Can they write code that's as solid, based on the fact that we need quality in all things of execution? I would say no, we shouldn't do that, because anytime you change a major platform, you're introducing a ton of risk. And my manager would say, well, points for Kevin, because that's really true. Even if I lost the argument at the end of the day, it would still be points for Jimmy or points for Mike. You're right. We may not decide. Now, in the other case, if they're like, well, AngularJS, can we get to market faster? Well, yeah, actually, the amount of code that needs to be done is lower and the compilers are faster. I don't know if any of that's true, but let's assume that it was. Then that manager would say, yeah, speed to market is what we care about. So think about it. If you go to the office every day and you don't know what your shared team kind of precepts, what are the shared values of this team, think about it. Talk with your teammates that you know and trust. When you figure that out and you base what you say to decision makers on that shared value, you will win a lot more, and when you lose, you will still get credibility points. And you will get invited back to further discussions more often, okay? So that's one cool thing. And this is something I ask a lot when people are saying, let's do something new. I'll say, what's the story behind this? And a lot of times, just because I get these requests a lot from developers, a lot of time is, yay, it's cool and it's new and it's fun and it's shiny and we want, and I'm like, why would we make a decision based on that? That's not gonna further any of our goals. So that's the first thing I want to tell you about. Those kind of things, telling it in a story that is MIP. Anybody remember what MIP is? Most important person, yes, but is also impactful and personal, right? Remember those puppies. We got to save the puppies, right? And making that a decision based on the shared values of our team, you will be invited to discussions you are sure you have no rational reason to be in that room. You're like, I'm a total imposter. Nobody who takes more time to ask me than one or two questions realize I know nothing, right? But they will ask you to come back because you know what we are about, not just the technology, right? So what I want to talk about now is how to retain that kind of value to the leaders of your organization into the future. Because there are some things that will be commoditized. I do worry about certain kinds of development jobs because these different frameworks and stuff like that are getting really good. A lot of that work can be commoditized. If you're racking servers, that kind of work is probably going to go away a lot faster as time goes on. So here's some stories I want to tell you that kind of illustrate this point, and I think you'll figure out the point before I actually put the slide up that tells what the point is. So the first story I want to tell you about is something called the ghost map. And so imagine you're in London and it's 1850. Now at that time, London was the largest, most wealthy, and best educated city in the world, okay? London also had an incredible problem back then. Basically, they had a pollution problem. Except that the newspapers called, they had a different name for it. They called London the Big Stink. And so what happened in London was people didn't know what germs were. And that saying, you don't crap where you eat, hadn't been invented yet. So people were doing that. This is a place called the Blackmore Swamp. It was in London at the time. Now it's all been paved over and long forgotten. But this was basically where the few sewers of London emptied before they went directly into the Thames River. Okay, and those sewers were built during Queen Elizabeth's time. Everyone else disposed of their waste usually in two, maybe three ways. The first way was to throw it on your roof. I don't know why. But throw it on your roof, you get it out of the house. The other way was to throw it in the basement. Because not many people lived in the basement, although some people did. And the third way was to throw it in the courtyard. They'd have houses here, and then they'd have houses along and then in back, so there'd be a courtyard. And so the records show that it was very common to have 8 and 12-foot high mounds of all the waste, right? The other big problem in London was not just human pollution, but they had the same kind of pollution problems we have, which is transportation systems. What was the main transportation system in the 1800s? Horses. So the newspapers, again, are very, very detailed in telling us that the average person probably had to step through 18-inch horse manure anytime they went out the door, right? 300,000 animals went into London every day, never to return, because that's how many they were butchering in the city. And every block had a butcher with a little corral, right? You didn't have to walk 10 miles to go get meat. He was down at the end of the street. And there was a little courtyard full of geese and sheep and, mutton and beef, and they just did their thing everywhere, and people threw the remnants of those animals out right there. There's a really funny story in 1850. 1854 actually, in which the stench got so bad in London that the parliamentarians in the House of Parliament ripped the 500-year-old embroideries, curtains off of the wall and covered their faces with them so they could run out of the House of Parliament, get into their carriages, and ride completely out of the city. That's how bad it was stinky for them. Most everybody else, of course, had to stay in the city, right? So guess what happens when you're living in that kind of filth? Disease, right? You're exactly right. Now, at that time, the predominant theory around illness, if you didn't happen to believe that it was God's wrath, which a lot of people did, that God chose you to get an illness because you deserved it. The other main theory was that something called miasma, or miasma. And an illustration of that is the disease called malaria, which is Italian for mal, aria, bad air, right? You've breathed air that was bad. That's where we get the superstition, at least in the US, I'm not sure if you have this in Britain, that you should hold your breath when you walk past a cemetery so that none of the bad air gets into you. Yeah. You don't have that one, Rich? Okay. Yeah, so that's, yeah. So I heard it mostly in the Northeast, yeah. So, yeah, hold your breath when you go by a cemetery, right? And so the Royal Society the Royal Academy saw that the people were getting sick in this one area of London. And they were getting sick with something called cholera. And they're like, wow, well, we're going to dig up the cemeteries there and transport the bodies away. And more people started to die, even after they finished that. Until like 10,000 people every week were dying from cholera. And this guy, his name is Jon Snow, not to be confused with Game of Thrones Jon Snow. He didn't believe this malaria stuff. He didn't believe this miasma stuff. He knew something else was going on. Actually, he was a highly reputed doctor, and he was the first doctor to use anesthesia in England. He was Queen Victoria's anesthesiologist, which was a new term they had to invent for him. And believe me, she loved this guy. Any of you ladies had children, right? Anesthesia, I'm just saying, good thing. So he got a little bit of leeway to investigate this in a way that the Royal Academy disapproved of. So they said, we don't want you to do this. We know what the problem is. It's bad air. And he's like, I don't think so. And they said, well, don't go any further. And he's like, oh, hello, Vicky. Well, he might not have said that. Yeah. And she's like, I give you royal permission. And he started to investigate. And he invented this thing called the ghost map. And what he did was he went to this part where the deaths were highest, and he bought a commercial map, and he went to each house in the area, and he knocked on the door to see who was sick. And at first, the tick marks he made on the map were of the number of people that died. And it turns out that wasn't enough. There wasn't enough room. So the tick mark became every 10 people. And that wasn't enough. You'd go to some houses and like an 8-year-old child would answer the door and say, oh yeah, my 6 brothers and sisters and my parents, they're all dead, right? And this is in a tenement building that had 4 floors and used to have 400 people in it. So these tick marks are 100 people. And he said, I think this is, the more I look at this, the more I see that this has to do with the location of where people are getting their water from. But there's a pump down here on Brewer Street. No one's getting sick. Everyone who's getting sick seems like it's located around this pump on Broad Street. And the Royal Society said, so what? He said, no, look, I think we need to take the handle off of this pump so people won't use it. And they said, nope, there's some cemeteries there, there's some slaughterhouses, lots of bad smells there, so don't do it. He said, okay, I've got to investigate deeper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find an exception to the rule. Anyone in this area who's not drinking the water, are they dying or not? And so he started to look around. Do you see it here on the map? Right over here. What do you think the main benefit, fringe benefit, of being an employee in this building is? You get to drink the beer, right? And this little building right next to it here, no deaths. That's a prison that has its own well in the courtyard. Everybody there drinks their own water, right? And he brought this to them and said, look, these people who are right in the middle of all these people dying, left and right by the hundreds, no one's dying there. He said, still don't believe you. So he went one step further and he said, okay, if I can find someone outside of the area who's dying, but are drinking Broad Street water, what's the correlation there? And sure enough, what he found was that there was a whole group of people who lived on the far side of the Thames who were dying. And guess what the correlation was? They used to live on Broad Street, and Broad Street pump, the water is slightly carbonated, slightly bubbly. And so Mom said to her boys, anytime you go to that side of town, bring me back a big pail of Broad Street water. And everyone on that side of the river who drank it died as well. A few survived, of course, but in general they died. Last time I was in London, I went to Broad Street and took a picture of the pump. He managed to convince the constable to take the pump arm off, and people stopped dying. He unfortunately died like a month later of an aneurysm at 46 years old, so he never got to see the 3-year battle with the Royal Society to take that off. And you know what convinced them finally? Was that in Italy, an Italian scientist invented the microscope. And when they took a look at the water, they were like, holy shit. There's a whole world of stuff in there, right? So what did he do that was special? Well, yes, but that's true. I can't refute that. But also what he did was he got to the base level of the data and understood it. So that's also what I'm talking about here in this next little story. Anyone heard of the Turing test? I know a few of us have, right? So this is a really interesting fact to me. Up until electricity, the biggest selling books around the world after the Bible were math books that were table after table after table of calculations. The word computer, up through electricity, actually a little bit before that, about 20 years before that, 1890, the word computer was a profession, like accountant or clerk. It was a job usually held by intelligent and skilled women, but naturally, as you ladies know, they weren't paid squat. And their job was to do long division and long multiplication, because it was hard to multiply 32,761 by 40,553, right? That took a long time. So what everybody who owned a business would do back then is they would buy these books on math that would have multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. They even had them for logarithms and stuff like that. It was invented by the Italians during the medieval period, the Genoan and Milanese and Venetian traders, right? And it's funny because they know for a fact that these books that were sold even through the late 1800s, they were basically the same material, because the exact same mistakes that were made in the late 1500s were carried through all the way to the late 1800s. People just copied it down, put it in the printing press, printed the books, right? But oh my God.
There weren't computers to look it up. If you wanted the tangent of, 22 degrees or something.
No kidding. Yeah. Well, they didn't have more than logarithmic through this era, but I bet they did they started to add them probably in the late 1800s, right? When they were, things like tangents and stuff would be great for building a railroad, right? I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So what happened was they had all these tables, all these calculations, and you fast forward up to the World War II era, and what the powers that be decided that they needed to do was that they needed to take this kind of math power that they had in these books, and they needed to apply that to artillery, because we've gotten really good at making gunpowder now, so the power of the charge does not vary greatly. I had V-E-R-Y and V-A-R-Y in that same sentence. So, so there was a time when you really couldn't be sure that a cannon would shoot the same distance between discharges, because the black powder varied a lot, right? But you get into say 1930, 1940, that's pretty well settled. But now what we want to know is, what if we change the cannon or the piece of artillery up 1 degree. How much further can it shoot? Well, we don't actually have to shoot it. We can use math to figure that out. What if we go up 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 degrees? What if 1 mile an hour wind is blowing from the east? A 2 mile, a 5 mile? You know, we can figure all of this out with math. And so they started to build these first series of machines to do those kind of calculations. And they hit a problem. And that problem was World War II, in which people were like dying all over the place and killing each other. And they thought, okay, we can continue to suffer with these code problems where we can't break these codes that the enemy have. So the Germans had a machine. Anyone know the name of the machine? Yeah, the Enigma machine. Unbreakable code. And don't believe that movie U-471 or whatever, total lies. But Alan Turing was one of the foremost thought leaders in this area in Britain. He had corollaries in the contemporaries in the United States who did the same kind of work. And his job was to help figure out how to break this code. And he started to work on this machine called Colossus at a place called Bletchley Park. And it was all electromechanical. You know, they hadn't invented transistors yet. So it actually, you know, you could hear it go ka-chunk, 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 you know, and things moving around in there. And they couldn't actually break the Enigma code until in talking to the people who were translators on these transmissions, they found out that at the close of every transmission, they said, Heil Hitler, at the end of every one. And so guess what we now have? We have like 2 or 3 vowels, right? That's really important. Were you raising your hand? Oh, okay, I didn't know if you were making yeah, we got 2 or 3 vowels. We got L, we've got T, we've got R. Man, we're gold. If you had that on Wheel of Fortune, you'd be like, I'm gonna go home with some money, you know? And so just incidentally, in this picture, the computer is actually the woman. She's the computer in this situation. So they used these electromechanical machines to start breaking this code, and Turing was so far ahead of his times. He invented this idea that computers are going to get so good that there will come a day when you will not be able to differentiate between a human being and a computer. And that has a couple names. It's sometimes called the imitation game. It's sometimes called the Turing test. And so the idea is, and they do a Turing test every year. And there's a person who's the questioner. And that questioner doesn't know whether the person they are talking to is a computer or is a real human being. And for a long time, up until even the mid-90s, it only took no more than 30 or 40 minutes to break it and to figure out whether it's a computer or not. Anyone know how long it takes now? It takes no less than 6 hours and 40 minutes to figure out whether that's a computer. Weirdly enough, and that's some Turing test questions back there, a conversation that's happening. Weirdly enough, it's really easy to tell if the person is a human. We have that test. Because all we have to do is look at what computers can't do. And they can't do a lot of stuff. Right? If it's textual, they can do a lot of those things. But if it's not textual, they have some difficulties. So it's called CAPTCHA, right? CAPTCHA will knock out a computer all the time. There are ways to break it now, but up until very recently, it was hard to break. One of the things, though, that's interesting with this is they said, okay, we got the Turing test. We want to take this a step further. What we want to do is we want to build a computer that can beat a world chess champion. And not just any world chess champion, the best world chess champion, the grandmaster of all times, Garry Kasparov. Anyone remember the computer? Big Blue, right? So here's what they did. They programmed this computer not just to play chess. There's what they call the brute force method, which is every time he makes a move, it would analyze every possible move, and then it would choose the best one. But they couldn't get it to answer in the right amount of time. So what they did is they studied how Garry Kasparov played chess, and they programmed it to look at those responses rather than every response. And Garry Kasparov found out about it. So when the match came along, who won? It's a trick question because you probably know who actually won at the end. Well, Big Blue actually won. But Garry Kasparov claims they cheated because he won the first couple games. And the way he won was he didn't play anything like Gary Kasparov plays. So Gary Kasparov, very aggressive player, he was very defensive, right? And he beat Big Blue until in the middle of the week, they went and reprogrammed the computer. And that's why he still will tell you that they cheated, right? But this is my point going back to the same point I made with the ghost map. They studied the lowest level details of the data that they could get. And that changed the outcome. Once they knew how same thing happened with Jeopardy. They built this machine. It was one of the earliest successful implementations of machine learning. They put through every Jeopardy question that had ever been asked. And then they parameterized those. So if there was a question, it was like, this is the tallest mountain, or the tallest mountain in Europe, and you would say, what is the Matterhorn, or whatever it is. They made that a parameter. What is the third tallest mountain in Europe? What is the fourth? So that every kind of permutation, what was this one? Watson knew how to deal with it, right? And in the end, Watson stomped the other players, right? But it didn't get every question right, and part of it was because there were questions that nothing like them had ever been asked before. Right? So, again, we're looking at the very lowest level of data that we can find, and we're seeing what that says about our story. Another similar story about anyone ever read 538.com? It's a really cool website. I really like it because they talk about sports and they talk about politics, but they're very empirical about all of it, right? Oh, is he really? I want it. Oh, man, yeah. Send that to me. So Nate Silver, he was a guy at Ernst & Young at the same time I was at Deloitte, and he was a little bit bored in his job. So he built this awesome set of analytics for baseball. And he wound up selling it and making a lot of money. And then he went on and he saw this thing in the political world in which he's like, you know what? There are these people that appear on television time and time again, pundits. And if we track their precision in their predictions over time, we see that they literally know less than if you just randomly picked who the winners were going to be. They were less effective at telling who winners were if you just randomly selected winners. He's like, what the heck? And so there's this thing called confirmation bias. And so what that means is, like, if I were to go to the web and I'm like, I don't know, let's say I said, I had this bias that all Muslims are violent. And then I said, went to Google and I said, Muslim violence. Am I going to get hits? Absolutely. And then I'm like, see, I told you. And it's like, well, if I looked at the inverse of that, I would see, if I said Muslim nonviolence, I'd see like all these protesters and how India was founded by nonviolent movement. And it's like, wow, I guess Muslims aren't violent, So confirmation bias is what these pundits were doing. So what happened was Nate Silver went and looked not at what the pundits were looking at. He went to every polling place in the country and looked at all the records they had for everything. And when that election rolled around, he called all 50 states. In the election after that, he accurately called 49 out of the 50 states. He also applied the same kind of models to lots of other things, like how stable are countries that have a downgrade in their sovereign debt ratios. And what he did was he didn't do what the pundits were doing, which was, the pundits were like, oh, I've talked to a bunch of people who I really trust and know, and who I think are really credible, and I think it's going to go this way. But those pundits didn't really think about the fact that they only talk to people they like, who pretty much have the same opinions they do, right? And so, for example, with one of the big hurricanes that was coming through, he double-checked what the insurance companies were saying. And the insurance companies said that we think that the amount of damage that's going to be done by Hurricane Agnes is going to be between $8 and $13 billion. And the state emergency management organizations said that they thought it might be between 10 and 20 billion, I'm sorry, $billion, not $1 million. And he said, no, it's going to be 75 to 85 billion. And it turned out it was $83 billion in damage, right? There are lots of movies nowadays that illustrate this in action. Has anyone ever seen Moneyball? What's the story with Moneyball?
Baseball, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can put three players together cheap and have the same statistics as an expensive guy.
right? And the key word there is statistics, right? So what was happening was the scouts were going out and they were watching players play, and they'd hear, oh, there's this really, really great player in Nebraska. You got to go check him out. And he'd go watch him. And he's like, this guy throws like a dork. But when you looked at the statistics, he was amazing. But he looked like a weirdo. So they're like, forget him. And so the Oakland A's were losing. And they had a few good players, and they could not afford to get another good player to help them get to the pennant. So they had a guy who loved baseball statistics, and he said, you know what? We don't need these superstar players. All we need to win games is to get on base. Because if you get on base enough, you score hits, you score runs, right? And he said, well, look at this guy. We could probably pay him $140,000 a year instead of $2 million a year, or $20 million a year for the superstar players. And we get 3 or 4 other guys like this, or 5 or 6 other guys like this, and we're going to start winning games. What do you think happened to the Oakland A's? They started winning a lot of games, right? It turned the industry upside down. And that's what they called Moneyball, right? There's another really good movie called The Big Short. Anyone seen that one? It's kind of depressing, but we made it through 2007 and 2008, so I'd encourage you to go back and look at it. And what happened was, during the Great Recession, there was a group of people who made a hell of a lot of money because they shorted the market. And how did they figure out that it was a good idea to short the market when everybody from Deutsche Bank to Bank of America to Goldman Sachs said, you are going to keep making money on real estate till the end of the age? How did they figure it out? Well, they actually went to the neighborhoods where these homes were selling for $400,000. And they're like, nobody's living in these houses. And they'd find that somebody was renting the house from somebody else who owned it. And then they go to talk to some of the people who own these mortgages. And they're like, oh yeah, I've got 4 or 5 houses because I'm going to flip them and make a ton of money. Right? And then they started to look at the neighborhoods, and they looked at look at this. A lot of people have missed paying their property tax this year, or this year and last year. And then they started to look at each other and like, this is a market on the verge of crashing. And so they bet against the market, and they made unbelievable amounts of money. They went to the lowest level of data, and they analyzed the data and learned what the data meant. What is the story the data is telling? And so, are you getting the message I'm sending with these 3 stories here? Here's Nate Silver. And here's the one other thing that I want to throw out too. What the experts are now saying is that data is like oil or like water. It is a natural resource. And if you're a company or a person that knows how to put data to work, you've got a job for life. Right? So earlier on I said, some of us may have a situation where are we going to be commoditized or not? Not if you know what the data is. Right? So if you're a DBA and you're working with databases and you're like, I don't know. Well, you'll still have a job, I think, until you're ready to retire. But, do you want those promotions? Do you want to be really, really valued? Know what the data is and what it means, and you will get invited to the table. Now, just to take this one more step further, there's another thing that's really, really new that's just started to emerge in the last 2 years, and it's all about algorithms now. So there's a really cool website. Kaylin, I'd love to get your opinion on this. There's a really cool website called Kaggle.com, okay? And so, Kaggle. I like to call it Kaggle because it reminds me of exercises, but, oh, okay, that's right. So Kaggle is Kaggle, and it's Kaggle? Is that what you call it? Okay, well, that would mean a lot less confusion. Yeah, and so, it's kind of for people who like data and who like to think about algorithmic approaches to things. And there are a half dozen contests running at any particular time that pay out $50,000 to $100,000 if you could figure out a better algorithm than what the people are using now. So there'll be things like, hey, here's this energy company. Can you figure out a better way to identify the winners and losers in these different, because if you do, they will not send a crew to that place. They'll send a crew to this place, right? For a long time, Netflix has had a standing yearly competition there. I think they pay $500,000 or $250,000. And it's to improve the algorithm of what movies it shows you when you're like, I don't know. Yeah, the recommendations engine. Thank you. Yeah, there's a ton of those out there because people are beginning to realize not only is data incredibly valuable, what you do with the data and how you manipulate it is, I mean, it's money in the bank, right? So that's pretty cool. And so people who grasp the value of data, people who grasp what you can do with data, that's what's going to separate those most important people from the journeymen, from the ditch diggers, metaphorically speaking in the IT sense, right? And for me, that kind of spells the difference between whether I get joy in my work or whether I'm kind of, maybe I'm getting ready to look for my next job, right? Because I really enjoy exercising my mind a lot more than just coming in and making sure the backups are good and I've got no errors on my servers and that kind of thing. So that's where I'm coming from. So remember, the secret ingredients, most important person in the room, deep domain knowledge. Know that data as deep as you can. Know that data as if it were a story. Be able to tell that story. Even if it's boring, it's okay. Data's that way. MIP, most important person, but also memorable, impactful, personal. You tell the story of what you think is best for us to do in terms of, our shared values, what's most meaningful to the people that's going to use this application, and you will be scoring credibility points all over the place where you didn't in the past. And then finally, you have those tech skills. You already have them. You're here in the room. But what are the values that the team has? If you keep coming back to that, people will never say, that's awful. They'll say, yeah, that's a great point. Now, they might not say, I agree with you, but they'll say that's a great point. But I respectfully disagree if they don't agree with you, right? So you'll score points in that. All right, so I'm going to skip that one because we had it in an earlier discussion. This is the way I like to characterize this whole presentation. If you go to work thinking that I'm here to solve IT problems, you're doing it wrong. If you go to the work and you say, there aren't IT problems, they're just people problems that we solve with information technology, you're doing it right, okay? Because there are times when you can walk in and say, well, why would we even use technology at all for that? I saw that back in year 2000, there was this huge discussion about how we would process, not we, a friend, worked in retail, they're having this huge knockdown, drag out arguments about how to, if the lights go out at year 2000, but we want to be able to conduct business after that. How are we going to do that? And they were having all these arguments, and I said to my friend, it's like, don't you still have the card sliders? He's like, yeah, we do. And he went to work, told his boss about it the next day, and he's like, yeah, we're going to use the card sliders. We just ordered like 50 million more of the carbon copy paper, It's like, yeah, just because we're technology people doesn't mean we have to use some computer program to fix the problem, right? I actually really lied a lot in that story because I didn't think of that at all. It was a different person, but I like to pretend that I was there, right? Yes, thank you. It's personal, right? It was a friend of mine, but he was telling me rather than me saying, well, why don't you do that? Yeah, so IT, I like to tell the story about the first time I had a major server crash as a DBA. It was a really big, expensive system. It was even before we had rack-mounted servers, okay? And it cost like $160,000 to outfit this compact computer. And I always feared that we'd have a crash at some point. And I knew that the CIO would call me and he'd be like, what happened to my server, Kevin? This expensive, almost $200,000 server. And he really surprised me when he called. When we had that first crash, he said, what happened to my data? How soon can you get it back online? I was like, boom, I had an epiphany. It was like, I have been putting value in all the wrong things. I was thinking it was all this expensive technology when in fact, no. It's like a vessel that holds, it's like a bottle, a piece of glass that holds, expensive wine. The wine is the asset. The data is the asset, not the technology. Memorable, impactful, personal. All right? So, what do you think? Any questions? Anyone seen this in action? Done this? Yeah? Let me tell you one more story. I'll wrap up here. A person that Mike and I know in common attended a session I did just on persuasion. So some of the stuff where I was talking about persuading people was held in common between these two sessions. And she had this problem where she could not get the director of IT to allow her team, the DBA team, to roll out servers with them going through it ahead of time and setting all the configuration settings and creating the files so the right file size and perhaps creating 4 data files instead of 1 data file, and all these kind of preemptive sort of measures that she wanted to take in order to effectively set up a really well-tuned configuration, right? And the manager just said no, time and time again. We're not measured on that. Well, we just need to get it out fast. That's what they measure us on, is how quickly we get it out on. And she tried several times. She had these proposals. Well, we're going to reduce the amount of time we spend with support. We're going to reduce the amount of time we have to fix problems. We're going to have to, it's going to improve this. All these facts and details, and he would never agree. And finally, I said, well, this manager doesn't care about that. What does the manager care about? I mean, and she's like, well, he's really budget conscious. No, not that kind of stuff. I mean, what does this person care about at the end of the day? And she's like, well, he's the youngest manager in the company that got to this position. It's like, oh, so he's ambitious. Okay. And does he plan to stay there forever? And she's like, no, he's looking for his next promotion. I'm like, so would you say his prestige in the organization is important to him? And she's like, that's critical to him. I said, why don't you talk about something that makes a difference to that? And so she called me like a week after the SQL cruise was over, and she's like, yeah, I told him we had to do something about our team's image problem. And he stopped right away and he said, what do you mean image problem? And I told him, and it wasn't a lie, I told him that the QA manager was complaining about our servers, that the dev manager was saying the servers would crash occasionally, that this other manager would say, what's going on with the SQL servers? And he said, what can we do about this? She said, well, I've got this proposal where we could set up the data files. He's like, make it happen. And she's like, I just had to tell you about that. Yeah. And I was like, yeah. So think about it in your experience too. You probably have a story or two like that. You know.
Oftentimes, what happens is people, if you're using technology facts, you want to communicate commands, they tell you to put it in terms of business value. And your story tells the flip side of it. That doesn't always work because those are just more facts. You just translate technology faster into more dollars.
Mm-hmm.
You add the story part. I think, at least for me, that's a missing piece.
Sure.
The other part that rings true about all those stories is none of those people got their impact the first time they told it. They have to be a little persistent.
That's a good point.
Don't expect that the first time you present something like this, that all of a sudden the water's going to part and everything's going to go.
Great point. Yeah.
You'll probably even lose more than you win.
Yeah, that's true also. And you'll probably lose a lot more when you're first trying it. Because as IT people, I don't think any of us are naturally comfortable in those kind of situations. It doesn't come naturally to us. So you may feel really awkward, and that might come through when you're trying to approach a topic like that. So sometimes it's really safe to do it. You're in a big group of people and you're asked to sit down, and we're going to, you may have a leader who likes to drive toward a consensus, which is a lucky thing. And a lot of times you can steer things pretty easily under those circumstances. But if you're one-on-one and you're like, I want to convince this one person to do something different, yeah, you need to be persistent and expect to lose or fail quite a bit until you, get some more comfort with it.
Well, also you build up your credibility as you try it for and demonstrate all these skills you just said.
There's this psychological property it's just the same as in physics. It's momentum, right? So and inertia, which is the flip side of it. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. That's momentum. Inertia is an object at rest, tends to stay at rest until acted upon by an external force. And it is absolutely true in interpersonal relationships. Like one of the ways I use that technique is usually when I start a session. I didn't do it tonight, but like if I'm in a big room that's not a kind of an intimate setting, I'll ask a question that 90% of the people in the room will say yes to. I'll be like, to pass someone else say something like, how many of you came from outside of the city of Seattle? You know it's an international conference, right? Most people don't live in Seattle at this conference. So like everybody's like, yeah, that's me. And then I'll be like, okay, who came from another country? But once you've got that momentum, people are like, they're already okay with nodding their head. So then when you ask a question that a lot of people wouldn't be inclined to start answering, it's like, anybody ever made this mistake? Well, they've already said yeah. So yeah, we're all friends together. Yeah, sure, I've made that mistake, Anybody prefer to use cursors? Oh yeah, I do. I don't want to be proud of. Yeah, with no exactly. So, yeah, Same thing happens in interpersonal relationships. So if you go to talk to your manager about something you want to do differently, or you're in a situation where you can change opinions, but you have never opened your mouth there before, what are you up against? You're up against inertia. Both internally, because you're not comfortable doing it, right? And externally, because people aren't really used to you speaking up, and they're not really sure what to do with your input. So that's why a lot of times you'll see some people, I'm not recommending you become a yes person, but sometimes you just agree with somebody else who's saying something smart. And once people are used to you being part of the conversation, that gets that ball rolling a little bit, That's why I'll also tell people who are really, really introverted, and I'm not trying to not, un-introvert you, make you an extrovert, but just say yes to people, don't look at your shoes all the time. Just say hi to the people you work with. Don't go straight to your cube. Because once they're used to you saying hi in the hall, they'll be like, oh, hi, and you won't feel so inhibited when you actually have an important question you want to ask. But you're like, gosh, it's 4:30 in the afternoon, we're going to go home soon, and I haven't said a word to them all day. In fact, I've kind of avoided them, so, I guess I won't do it. But if you get that little bit of momentum going and have said hello and have a good lunch, when you actually have something to ask, it becomes really easy because you've got that momentum. All right, I've talked way too much. I hope this was useful to you and informative, and I hope it was fun. Thanks.